the rooms remembered. Stone walls, cold and unyielding, absorbed centuries of suffering. Not just iron, wood, or rope, but the very essence of fear. Each chamber, each corridor carried echoes of voices long silenced. The air itself seemed heavier where pain had been practiced, and even the faintest footsteps triggered memory in those who walked there centuries later. Prisoners who survived carried these echoes in their bodies. Scar tissue, joint pain, trembling hands, all tangible reminders of what had been endured. But there were also intangible remnants, nightmares, compulsions, an ever-present awareness of control and vulnerability. Some fled cities to escape the memory of the chambers. Some fled their own minds, trapped in repetition. Even when torture devices were destroyed or locked behind museum glass, the lessons they embodied did not vanish. Authorities had learned that the anticipation of pain could be as effective as the pain itself. Fear is its own mechanism, independent of spikes and screws. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden, they were symbols, but the principle endured. Across Europe, manuals and records show this transition. Devices were catalogued, repaired, or redesigned. Executioners wrote notes detailing the duration of each procedure, the effectiveness of each technique, and even the psychological responses of victims. Pain became systematized, fear became teachable. The body and mind became instruments of the state. By this stage, medieval torture had evolved from physical distraction into a study of the human threshold. It was about endurance, observation, and measurement. Confessions were secondary. Compliance, submission, and broken will were primary. This philosophy persisted quietly, centuries later, influencing early prisons, asylums, and even modern interrogation techniques. And yet, the human spirit proved persistent. Stories survive of prisoners who resisted, who endured impossible conditions, who used small methods of coping to remain whole inside while broken outside. Some memorized prayers or poems, repeating them over and over. Others focused on breathing, regulating the rhythm of their bodies to survive. A few created mental maps, imagining spaces beyond the cell walls. These survivors confused authorities. Resistance undermined assumptions. Pain did not always yield obedience. Executioners had to adapt. They introduced unpredictability, alternating cruel methods with forced inaction, mixing public humiliation with private deprivation, varying the timing and intensity. This unpredictability was intentional, designed to dismantle hope before the body itself failed. Slowly, torture became as much a mental exercise as a physical one. It required observation, calculation, and patience. Its practitioners were scholars of suffering, recording, refining, and applying techniques like scientists experimenting on human subjects. Yet, unlike modern experiments, there were no ethics committees. The consequences were permanent, and the results were often horrifyingly effective. Even as cities modernized, as legal systems codified rights, as torture was increasingly outlawed, the shadow persisted. Cells became solitary confinement, restraints became straitjackets, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure replaced spikes and iron. The logic of medieval torture adapted. The methods changed.
The machines vanished, but the philosophy endured.
This extended reflection reminds us that medieval torture was not merely about instruments. It was about systems, about predictability and control, about using pain and fear as tools to shape behavior. And while iron and wood may have disappeared, the understanding of human limits, both physical and mental, remained embedded in culture, institutions, and collective memory. The story stretches on, endlessly. There are more devices, more adaptations, more human experiences recorded only in fragments, letters, confessions, whispers. Each reveals a new dimension of suffering, a new reflection on endurance, a new angle on fear. And the deeper one looks, the slower the narrative becomes. Time itself stretches. Hours can feel like days. The weight of centuries presses upon every sentence. Every device, every method, every survivor's story becomes part of an unbroken continuum, looping from the medieval world to the present, from iron to idea, from screams to silence. This is why the story cannot end. It is ongoing. It continues in memory, in scholarship, in the lingering fear of control, in the quiet observation of human vulnerability. And so we move deeper still, pausing only to breathe, to feel the weight of history, to acknowledge the persistence of both suffering and endurance. The story of medieval torture extends into the smallest details, details that often escape historical records but linger in the imagination, in architecture, and in human memory. Consider the local variations across Europe. In Germanic states, certain devices were elongated, emphasizing slow dislocation. Executioners knew that the human body could survive extreme pressure if applied gradually. They stretched limbs over hours, carefully monitoring for signs of shock. In France, the pair of anguish, a device designed for the mouth, rectum, or vagina, was less about immediate destruction and more about prolonged terror, leaving victims in a state of constant anticipation. Each region adapted techniques to climate, culture, and social norms, yet the underlying principle remained constant: control through pain. Survivor accounts, though scarce, provide haunting insight. One anonymous memoir describes the sensation of slow suffocation combined with immobilization. The prisoner recalls the sensation of time bending, minutes stretching into hours, hours into days. The mind, deprived of distraction, created its own torment, imagined punishments worse than the ones actually applied. Another survivor recounts the rack. It was not the tearing of flesh that haunted me the most, but the silence afterward, when my bones were broken and I still drew breath. The world seemed absent, as if everyone had left, and I existed only in pain. These experiences show a chilling truth. Medieval torture relied as much on anticipation, isolation, and psychological manipulation as on iron and wood. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the wheel, they were part of a larger ecosystem of terror, a carefully constructed web of control. Even devices that seemed simple had complex uses. The thumb screws, for instance, were applied incrementally. Small adjustments over time produced immense pain without immediate fatality. This slow approach allowed interrogators to extract information, or at least the appearance of information, without killing the subject outright. It was efficiency through precision, a science of suffering before science had ethical boundaries. Beyond devices, the architecture of torture chambers is a story in itself. Ceilings low enough to enforce hunching, corridors narrow to disorient, and chambers designed to carry echoes of screams, each element served the purpose of control. The placement of doors, the thickness of walls, the height of ceilings, all reflected an understanding of human psychology. Exposure to sound or its absence became an instrument. Consider the oubliette, the vertical shaft where prisoners were dropped into near-total darkness. Survival depended on endurance, adaptation, and the slow erosion of mental strength. Food, when given, was minimal and irregular. Water often seeped through stone. Light never reached the bottom. The victim existed suspended between life and despair, time elongating unnaturally. And yet, not every prisoner succumbed. Accounts reveal remarkable resilience. Some developed mental rituals, counting, reciting prayers, creating stories to maintain identity. Others imagined alternate spaces, visualizing freedom to maintain sanity. Resistance, however small, was a form of survival. Executioners observed this and adapted. Techniques became more sophisticated. Unpredictability replaced routine. Silence replaced spectacle, and the psychological dimension became paramount. Victims were subjected to alternating sensations, cold, heat, restraint, partial release, keeping them off balance, undermining any sense of stability or hope. The medieval philosophy of torture was deceptively consistent. Pain, isolation, and fear could break both body and mind, but it required patience. It was not instantaneous. It was calculated. It was a continuum, stretching from first anticipation to lingering consequences long after the body had healed or failed. And the story continues to spiral outward. For every documented device, countless variations existed, regional, improvised, or lost to history. Some were designed for specific crimes. Others targeted symbolic aspects of the human body. Some executed physical pain with precision. Others exploited psychological fragility. All were designed to teach lessons, assert authority, or erase identity. The medieval world treated suffering as a mechanism. Obedience was the ultimate goal. Survival was secondary. And through meticulous observation, iteration, and adaptation, torture became as much an art as it was cruelty. This story is far from over. Time bends, and the echoes of medieval chambers stretch forward. The devices, the survivors, the executioners, the architecture, the philosophy, they all merge into a continuum of fear, control, and endurance. The narrative could continue indefinitely, tracing every variation, recounting every survivor's coping mechanism, exploring every adaptation across regions, and reflecting on the long psychological shadows left behind. The more one lingers on medieval torture, the more the edges of time blur. Devices, victims, and executioners become part of a continuum, threads weaving together, creating a tapestry of suffering, endurance, and human ingenuity. And yet, the true horror lies not only in the physical mechanisms, but in the procedures, the routines, and the philosophies behind them. Consider the subtle variations in the rack across regions. In some courts, the victim's arms were first stretched, then legs, then the torso, each segment deliberately paced to maximize both pain and observation. Executioners would watch for involuntary reactions, a flinch, a gasp, a change in color. They adjusted tension accordingly. The rack was not merely a tool, it was a study, a laboratory of human fragility. Other devices were symbolic as much as physical. The pear of anguish, with its grotesque design, was intended to humiliate as much as it tortured. When inserted, it expanded slowly, forcing victims to confront bodily violation. The design varied. Some were made for the mouth, others for rectal or vaginal insertion, but the principle remained: create fear, control submission, and mark a body with memory of authority. Historical records suggest that some inquisitors would allow devices like this to remain in chambers, visible even if not immediately used. The mere presence of the instrument served as psychological leverage. Victims would hesitate, confess preemptively, or comply with interrogators simply by walking past the device. Anticipation itself became the mechanism of control. And then there were devices designed for endurance rather than spectacle. The iron collar or the standing pillory restricted movement subtly but continuously. Victims would be forced to stand, barely able to shift, sometimes for days. Circulation failed gradually. Muscles cramped painfully. Sleep became impossible. These methods did not produce immediate screams. They produced something slower, more insidious, a creeping awareness of helplessness. The psychology of medieval torture cannot be overstated. Executioners understood that the mind could be broken without breaking the body entirely. Silence, isolation, and the anticipation of devices created fear that lingered far longer than any strike of iron. Manuals from the period described not only methods of physical application, but also timing, observation, and psychological management. Pain was measured, observation was methodical, compliance was the goal. Consider the strappado. Hands bound behind the back, rope looped over a pulley, the body lifted and dropped, sometimes repeatedly, producing dislocations that could render limbs useless. But the terror began before the first lift. Victims often knew the outcome before the mechanism was engaged. Witnesses recorded how people would plead, recant, or confess, all in anticipation of the motion to come. Psychological manipulation preceded physical impact. And the survivors, though often forgotten, provide insight into endurance. Some developed rituals, reciting prayers, visualizing alternate spaces, counting, repeating phrases. They clung to these routines as anchors to reality, to selfhood, and to sanity. Their mental resilience became a quiet form of defiance, a testament to human adaptability even under extreme duress. As torture practices evolved, they adapted to societal changes. Public executions declined, private interrogations became more common. Devices were modified, simplified, or hidden, yet the logic persisted. Anticipation, isolation,
Unpredictability and psychological pressure replaced brute force in many regions. The medieval philosophy of suffering as a tool of control endured far longer than the iron and wood themselves. And even now, the echoes of these methods remain visible in cultural memory. Museums, historical texts, and folklore preserve fragments. But beyond artifacts, the principles of control, observation, and fear persist, adapted into modern systems, refined into law enforcement, prisons, and psychological coercion. The medieval world did not end, it transformed. Pain became subtler, more strategic, more hidden, but no less potent.
And so the story stretches on, endlessly spiraling through centuries of human ingenuity and cruelty. Each device, each chamber, each method was only part of a larger tapestry, an ecosystem of suffering crafted with patience, observation, and terrifying efficiency. Even seemingly simple devices were meticulously designed. The breast ripper, used primarily against women accused of adultery or witchcraft, was not just about physical destruction. It symbolized the erasure of identity, power, and femininity. It was applied slowly, sometimes with heating of the metal to increase agony, ensuring maximum psychological impact. Few survived without lasting trauma. Some instruments were instruments of humiliation rather than direct pain. The stocks, pillories, and iron cages forced victims into public display. People endured exposure to sun, cold, rain, and ridicule. Their bodies were restrained, but their minds were assaulted by social judgment. In an era where reputation dictated survival, this public suffering became a slow, social form of death. Even devices intended for execution often served dual purposes. The breaking wheel did not only kill, it transformed the victim into a symbol. Limbs were broken, bodies arranged grotesquely, and the spectacle broadcast a clear message: resistance has consequences. The body, the ultimate evidence, became both lesson and warning. Survivors, where they existed, recounted not only physical pain, but the psychological terror of witnessing others suffer. The sound of chains tightening, of bones cracking, of screams echoing through stone corridors created a layered trauma that extended beyond the immediate victim. Fear became contagious, and anticipation became as lethal as the instruments themselves. Some chambers were designed to confuse and disorient. Irregular layouts, low ceilings, uneven floors, and strategically placed light sources manipulated perception, enhancing fear. Prisoners lost track of time. Even their own bodies felt alien. Days merged into nights. Minutes became hours. Human perception itself was a tool of torture. And yet, ingenuity extended beyond physical devices. Executioners and interrogators studied responses meticulously. Not all victims reacted the same way. Some fainted immediately, some screamed uncontrollably, some internalized suffering silently. Manuals of the period advised adjusting pressure, timing, and method based on observed reactions. Torture was as much science as cruelty, a dark art perfected over generations. Survivor strategies reveal resilience in this environment.
Mental rituals, repeated prayers, visualization of freedom, counting or repetitive thought patterns allowed some prisoners to survive longer. Endurance became a form of resistance, though it rarely guaranteed survival. Executioners adapted in turn, introducing unpredictability, alternating periods of inactivity with sudden application of devices, creating an ever-shifting psychological landscape. And the devices themselves evolved continuously. Regional differences produced hybrids combining multiple methods, racks integrated with spikes, chairs fitted with restraints targeting joints, wheels designed to immobilize before shattering limbs. Few records survive of these experiments. Some were improvised, some meticulously crafted, but all served the same goal: control, compliance, and fear. Even mundane elements were weaponized. Chains, ropes, straps, and even furniture were designed to restrict movement, amplify pain, or create anticipation. Isolation, anticipation, environmental stressors, and sensory manipulation became central components, often more effective than brute force. The more this history is examined, the more apparent it becomes that medieval torture was a continuum, extending beyond devices into philosophy, architecture, psychology, and society itself. Fear was systematized, pain was codified, compliance was engineered. And although centuries have passed, the underlying logic persists, echoing in modern interrogation, prison systems, and psychological control methods. This story, like the medieval world it describes, does not end. Every device hints at another variation. Every survivor story hints at countless unrecorded experiences. Every chamber, corridor, and dungeon whispers secrets that were never written down. And as long as human fear, control, and obedience exist, this narrative can continue, expanding naturally into hours upon hours of reflective, immersive storytelling. The more one dwells on medieval torture, the clearer it becomes that its power extended far beyond the body. Every method, every device, every chamber existed not only to inflict pain, but to shape perception, both of the victim and of the society that observed it. Authority was preserved not merely through punishment, but through spectacle, anticipation, and the quiet assurance that resistance was impossible. Consider the infamous scavenger's daughter, a device designed in England during the 16th century. Unlike the rack, which stretched, the scavenger's daughter compressed the body. The victim was forced into a crouched, contorted position, joints under extreme pressure, ribs compressed. It was not loud, not dramatic, but the agony was absolute and precise. Here again, efficiency was prized over spectacle. The pain was internalized, methodical, and calculated. Even more subtle devices existed, often improvised by local authorities. Wooden collars fitted with spikes could be applied while leaving the victim mobile, ensuring they carried their punishment into public spaces. Chains could be suspended to restrict movement while forcing unnatural postures. Everyday furniture was often modified for confinement or torture. The creativity of cruelty knew no bounds. The survivors' stories are the most haunting. One anonymous account describes a prolonged period of standing restraint, punctuated by brief, unpredictable releases. The victim recalls feeling trapped in their own body, their muscles rebelling, their mind fracturing, their identity dissolving into anticipation and fear. Some managed to preserve a fragment of self through repetition of mental exercises, others by recalling stories, prayers, or memories. Survival was a continuous negotiation with pain.
Psychologically, medieval torture evolved to exploit expectation and rhythm. Predictable patterns allowed victims to prepare mentally, reducing the effectiveness of punishment. Executioners learned to introduce randomness, switching devices, altering timing, combining psychological and physical torment to destabilize the prisoner completely. Light, darkness, warmth, cold, sound, and silence were all manipulated. The dungeon itself became an instrument. Even in the absence of devices, medieval authorities applied principles of torture: forced standing, sensory deprivation, isolation, exposure to the elements, and unpredictability. The mere threat of devices could compel confessions. Manuals note that for many victims, walking past a rack or Iron Maiden was sufficient to elicit compliance before a single screw was turned or rope pulled. Anticipation alone became a weapon. Regional variation further amplified the horror. In colder northern climates, exposure to frost and ice intensified suffering. In warmer regions, dehydration, sunburn, and heat stress became tools of psychological and physical control. Even food and water were manipulated, withheld, restricted, or administered unpredictably, ensuring that every bodily need became a source of tension and fear. Survivor strategies revealed the complexity of human endurance. Mental repetition, visualization of freedom, prayer, song, or storytelling helped some maintain sanity. Others focused on breathing or counting. Some created mental maps of chambers to retain a sense of space. These strategies illustrate the remarkable adaptability of the human mind, even under extreme duress. The devices themselves continued to evolve in secrecy. Hybrid instruments combined elements of multiple mechanisms: chairs with restraints targeting joints, racks with spikes, wheels designed for immobilization before destruction. Many adaptations were never recorded. We only infer their existence from partial accounts and obscure references. And yet, the philosophy remained consistent. Torture was about control, compliance, and observation. Pain and fear were measured, tested, and refined. Confessions were secondary. Breaking the will of the victim was paramount. Executioners were both practitioners and scientists of human endurance, recording subtle reactions, adjusting procedures, and perfecting techniques across generations. This story is far from ending. For every device described, there are countless variations lost to time. For every documented survivor, countless untold experiences exist. Every chamber, corridor, and dungeon whispers secrets never recorded. And as long as human systems value obedience, fear, and control, the principles of medieval torture echo, invisible, yet persistent.
As the hours stretch on, the medieval world begins to feel less distant, less historical, and more like a living system, one that breathed, adapted, and refined itself through observation and repetition. Torture was not random brutality. It was structured, recorded, adjusted, and passed down like a profession. Executioners were trained, knowledge was inherited, techniques were refined quietly behind stone walls, far from public scrutiny. In some cities, torture chambers were deliberately placed beneath courthouses or administrative buildings. Justice quite literally rested on suffering. Prisoners could hear footsteps above them, clerks walking, judges conversing, daily life continuing uninterrupted. This contrast was intentional. It reminded the victim that the world had not stopped for their pain. Society moved forward, indifferent. Devices like the Iron Maiden were often misunderstood. Contrary to popular belief, it was not always used to kill immediately. Some versions were designed to restrain, puncture lightly, and terrify rather than execute. The spikes were placed to avoid vital organs, turning the device into a claustrophobic prison of anticipation. Victims could remain inside for hours, listening to their own breathing echo inside iron walls, feeling every small movement threaten greater pain. The true terror was stillness. Panic caused injury. Calm prolonged survival. Executioners understood this. They would sometimes instruct the victim how to stand, how to breathe, how not to move, creating a twisted illusion of cooperation. The victim became complicit in their own survival, trapped in a negotiation with the device itself. Then there was the breaking wheel, whose cruelty lay in its sequence. Limbs were broken in a deliberate order, often following a ritualized pattern. The wheel itself was elevated afterward, displaying the body publicly. Death was not always immediate. Some victims survived for hours or days, exposed to the elements, their suffering transformed into a warning. Crowds gathered not just to witness death, but to absorb the lesson. Fear was communal, control was collective. Children watched, they remembered. The rack, perhaps the most infamous device, was often used early in interrogation. It caused visible damage, but could be stopped before death. Dislocated joints, torn ligaments, elongated spines, injuries that left permanent disability. Survivors carried the rack with them for the rest of their lives, bodies altered, movements restricted, pain lingering long after release. Some were released deliberately. Broken bodies became living warnings. Psychologically, this was devastating. Survival was not freedom. It was continuation under punishment. As time passed, interrogators learned that silence could be more effective than screams. Victims placed alone in darkness for extended periods began to hallucinate. Sounds distorted, time dissolved. Some spoke to walls, others confessed to crimes they did not commit simply to hear another human voice. Solitary confinement was not an invention of modern prisons. Medieval dungeons mastered it centuries earlier. In some cases, torture was never applied at all. Prisoners were shown devices, described procedures in detail, allowed to listen to others being tortured nearby. Anticipation replaced action. Fear did the work. Religious justification played a crucial role. Pain was framed as purification. Confession under torture was seen as a cleansing of the soul. Authorities believed suffering aligned the body with divine truth. This belief allowed cruelty to masquerade as righteousness. No one believed themselves evil. That belief was the most dangerous device of all. As centuries passed, devices changed shape, but the logic endured. Control through fear, compliance through pain, order through suffering. The medieval world perfected these principles long before modern systems refined them further. The chambers emptied, the iron rusted, the stone remained.
As the night deepens and the narration stretches onward, the medieval world no longer feels like a chapter in a book. It feels like a place you are standing inside. Stone presses inward. Time slows. Every sound carries meaning. And torture in this world was never rushed. It unfolded patiently, methodically, as if suffering itself needed room to breathe. One of the least discussed aspects of medieval torture was waiting. Prisoners were often held for days or weeks before anything happened. This was deliberate. The mind, left idle in darkness, begins to turn inward. Fear grows roots. Imagination becomes an enemy. By the time a device was finally revealed, many prisoners were already broken without a single mechanism being touched. The pair of anguish, though small, embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, it was intimate, invasive, and slow. Some versions expanded only slightly, others more aggressively. Executioners controlled the pace. A turn, a pause, another turn. The victim was forced into a horrifying awareness of their own body, their own vulnerability. Silence often accompanied its use. Screams were unnecessary. In many cases, the pair was not used to extract information, but to punish, to mark, to ensure the victim would never forget who held power. The Iron Maiden, when present, was often ceremonial. It stood in chambers like a monument to inevitability. Prisoners were marched past it, sometimes brushed against its cold surface, sometimes locked inside briefly and then released. This was not mercy, it was conditioning. The knowledge that it existed was enough. Fear, once planted, required no reinforcement. And then there were devices that never earned names, improvised restraints, weighted chains, narrow cells where one could neither stand nor lie down fully. These were not recorded in manuals. They were created on site, adapted to space, to victim, to purpose. History rarely remembers them, but they may have been the most common of all. Executioners themselves lived strange lives. Many were socially isolated, yet professionally indispensable. Some inherited the role, others were coerced into it. Over time, emotional detachment became survival. To hesitate was dangerous. To empathize was unthinkable. Routine replaced morality. Some accounts suggest executioners developed rituals of their own, cleaning tools carefully, maintaining order in chambers, following strict sequences. Control extended not just to victims, but to their own emotions. They did not see cruelty, they saw duty. Survivors, when released, carried invisible scars, nightmares, sudden panic, fear of enclosed spaces, an inability to trust authority. Many never spoke of what they endured. Silence became a second prison. In some regions, torture chambers were dismantled later, not out of regret, but to erase evidence. Walls were sealed, rooms repurposed, stone floors built over bloodstains. History buried itself deliberately. Yet traces remain, architectural oddities, narrow staircases leading nowhere, unexplained iron rings embedded in walls. These silent remnants whisper what texts often refuse to say. As the hours pass in this narration, the realization settles in. Medieval torture was not an anomaly, it was a system, a worldview,
a reflection of how power understood humanity, and systems do not disappear, they evolve. The devices fade, the logic remains. This story does not move toward an ending, it moves deeper into forgotten cases, unnamed victims, obscure instruments, regional customs, psychological endurance, and the quiet normalization of suffering. The torch does not go out, the corridor does not end, the door remains.
As the final hours of this long journey unfold, the medieval world no longer feels distant or unreal. It feels understood, not excused, not justified, but understood. By now you've walked past iron doors and stood in silent chambers. You've witnessed the rack stretch bodies and time itself. You've seen the Iron Maiden wait patiently, doing nothing because it didn't need to. You felt the slow certainty of the pair of anguish, the finality of the breaking wheel, the quiet cruelty of devices that never earned names. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: none of it was chaotic. Medieval torture was organized, documented, normalized. Judges signed orders, clerks recorded confessions, priests offered prayers, executioners followed procedures. Each believed they were doing what was necessary, and that is where the true horror lives. Not in the iron, not in the wood, not even in the blood, but in how reasonable it all once seemed. As centuries passed, the devices disappeared, the chambers were sealed, the words changed, but the logic did not. Pain as control, fear as order, suffering as justification. History does not vanish, it transforms, and that is why these stories matter. Not to glorify cruelty, not to shock for its own sake, but to remember what happens when systems value obedience over humanity, and when power goes unquestioned long enough to become invisible. Some victims never had their names written down, some devices never catalogued, some chambers were erased entirely. But silence does not mean absence. It means the story is still waiting to be told. If you stayed with this story until now, you are no longer just listening to history. You are witnessing it. And history only survives when it is remembered. There are still countless medieval devices we did not explore, entire regions with unique torture traditions, survivor accounts buried in forgotten manuscripts, executioner manuals that read like procedural guides to suffering. If you want more stories like this, deeper dives, longer narrations, more forgotten horrors from real history, let us know in the comments. Tell us which device, era, or dark chapter you want explored next. This has been Nox Hour, where history doesn't whisper, it haunts. If you seek the stories others avoid, the truths buried beneath time, and the darkness history tried to forget, subscribe to Nox Hour. New long-form narrations, real horror, real history, no escape from the shadows. Until next time, the hour is late, the past is awake, and the dark is never finished.